Okay, welcome everyone. This is Marvin Swartz from the Wilson Center for Science and Justice at the Duke Law School and the Department of Psychiatry at Duke. And we're delighted to uh, have this session today on alternatives to police response to behavioral crises. So we're excited to have this conversation. All the participants are on mute during the session. So if you do want to raise a question, just write in the chat area and we'll respond after our initial set of comments. So thanks for joining us once again. Our guests today are Dr. Tracy Kesey, who's the Senior Vice President of Justice Initiatives and co-founder of the Center for Policing Equity. She oversees all law enforcement relationships and program implementation for that organization. Additionally, she works closely with communities to ensure their representation and participation in the co-production of public safety. Prior to her return to CPE, she served as the first ever Deputy Commissioner of Equity and Inclusion at NYPD. And she has quite a distinguished career, and I'm glad we'll be hearing more from her. We also have Tim Black with us today. He is the operations coordinator for the Whitebird Clinic, a health clinic in Eugene, Oregon, which is a companion project of Cahoots, who are a non-police, unarmed first responder group, EMTs and mental health workers who respond to 20% of the 9/11 and non-emergency calls in the Eugene, Springfield area. So we'll be hearing more about that program, and we're excited to hear that. And then finally, our last speaker is Christy Lopez, who is with the Georgetown Law, and she served as the deputy chief in the special litigation section of the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice. And she led the division's groups conducting pattern or practice investigations of police departments and other law enforcement agencies. She too has an extensive CV, and most notable of recent accomplishment is she led the team that investigated the Ferguson police and was the primary drafter of the Ferguson report and negotiator of the Ferguson consent decree. So thank you all for joining us. And if we could start out, we'll ask Dr. Kesey to make some remarks about her work in this area and some of the developments in alternative responses to police involvement in behavioral health crises. Dr. Kesey?
Thank you, Marvin, and thank you for the invitation. And my pleasure to sort of kick things off. So I want to just sort of step back a bit and just kind of frame why we're having this particular conversation about alternatives to mental health as opposed to arrests. We're all very aware of the events of last summer, the homicide of George Floyd. But I have to always lift this up as the fact that the inequities that we're seeing, not just in treatment in law enforcement, but in the health system, is not new to Black and Brown communities. What is new is the prominence and now the sort of, I would say, very loud conversation around what is the role of police in this particular social space. We know from hearing from chiefs that they have always been tasked with things that they do not want to do. They are the ones that are open every day, 24/7, 365 days a year. Sometimes politically, it's just expedient to get them to do that work as opposed to really look at the situation. So we find ourselves today really having pronounced conversations about whether or not co-response models or even alternative sort of models will meet the needs of Black and Brown communities. So the work the CPE does is specific to those communities and centering them in those works, and it's really trying to unpack them from criminalizing social behaviors, and where we find mental health is one of those things. And it also is that same space where we get the prominence in the shootings and the extra uses of force for someone who just simply needs to have some type of other assistance. So I think that's important to raise. So as we do our work on the ground with communities, we find that the conversation really kind of splits in a couple of different ways. So one, alternative models to mental health provide sort of that promise that we can do things differently. But I also have to add is that this particular sort of ask has been asked before. And the question was, and the question still remains, whether or not there's an appetite to fund these types of initiatives. We've known these models have been around for a while. They've been proof of concept. Tim is here. He's going to talk about Cahoots, which is probably one of the more prominent ones that we know of, and Leeds, STARS in Denver that's based off of the Cahoots model, Marco in Oakland. So there's a number of alternatives that are out there that we know that work. But what we find on the ground is there seems to still be this tension between whose role really is it, especially when you have folks that are in crisis and all of those narratives that surround the crisis itself. When we talk about the work on the ground with Black and brown folks, we often are looking at communities that never had been invested in the first place. And now we're really talking about, do we invest finally in those communities and providing them the help that they need? What is interesting about this moment in time as well is that we know there's a lot of work of all these models going on the ground, but one of the things that we're thinking about as social scientists is, are they replicable? A lot of times what we'll do is we will take models that work elsewhere, and do we really look at the component parts to see how they will fit into urban communities, rural communities, and really having a good sense of what type of cultural adjustments we may need to make. That's one part of it. The other part of it is the staffing, right? So you cannot create these models out of thin air. You have to have folks who are available to do the work, who have the resources to do the work, and are also going to be culturally sensitive to those that are doing the work. The concerns that are often raised by community is that are we trading one issue from police to another into a system that has its own issues around inequities. And so we really have to think about, how do we talk about this work and how do we do this work? The other part of this too really has to do with, what is the most appropriate model? We know that there have been incredible results out of a lot of different types of models, but the question then becomes about scalability, about, do we have the appropriate needs being met in those specific communities? And the communities, the ones who are identifying what those needs are, and not the other way around, because we still have a lot of conversations about who's making those decisions on what's best for community. So that is something that is still a conversation that is working its way, I should say, through lots of communities. And it looks very different, whether you are in Denver or you're in Seattle, or if you are, down south, they look very different. And the attitudes and beliefs around mental health are very different as well. And so there's a really good need for alignment and education around what it is and what it isn't. But I would tell you that in our work that we do at CPE, it is just readily acknowledged that this is not a space for law enforcement. The chiefs will reinforce that, and the community will certainly tell you. I think the challenge for us moving forward today is, what is that model? What does it look like? Does it have to be the same for every community? Does it really, help from not just a holistic perspective, but on the individual level as well? So not just programmatic, but are those things and supports in place for folks in the meantime, in between time, right? So not everything is a crisis phase. And the other part of this, in building these types of systems too, can the systems handle the pressure? Because typically once folks understand services are readily available, that need and demand increase. And so really making sure that before we open and move these things into certain communities, that we really truly do take a look at not just, is that particular program right for that community, but how will it be supported and sustained? And then lastly, for me, it is really about the evaluation. How do we know these programs are doing what they say they do? And then making sure that we sustain the ones that do and tweak and remove the ones that don't. Right now, there is a sense of urgency in a lot of Black and brown communities, but I caution on the sense of urgency to make sure that we are truly looking at these different types of models, and that they are going to provide exactly what communities of color are asking to happen on the front end, and that is to have services when needed, support when needed, and not to be jailed because of it. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the conversation with my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kesey. Tim Black, do you want to tell us a little bit about the work that you all are doing?
Absolutely. And thank you all for taking some time out of your day for this conversation. So as Marvin mentioned, Cahoots is one program of Whitebird Clinic here serving the Eugene Springfield metro area in Oregon. Just for a little bit of context, we're on the almost on the coast, about halfway between San Francisco and the Canadian border. You know, over the years, our community has really experienced a lot of the same issues that have really impacted, you know, the whole West Coast, and that goes back to the early '60s with initial deinstitutionalization and a lot of the practices of both the Kennedy and then, you know, the Johnson administrations that led to a very profound need for mental health services oriented in a different way than what was traditionally offered. The founders of Whitebird Clinic really saw a lot of potential by creating services that were designed to meet people where they are at, that utilized harm reduction as our really kind of primary role, and that we approach our situations through this lens of least intervention necessary. When we first started our clinic in '69, we had a crisis line. It's the same number that folks can call today, 50 years later. And as soon as that phone line started ringing, we started to hear about these situations in the community that really deserved a different kind of response than what they were getting. You know, seeing a lot of officers go out for these situations that resulted in somebody going to the hospital where they were given Thorazine and then discharged in worse shape than they went into the hospital under. Recognizing that impact and that intersection of policing mental health and addiction, we endeavored to set out what we called initially the Bummer Squad. And that was a mobile crisis response using volunteers on kind of an ad hoc staffing to really just be out there, reducing the impact of traditional public safety resources for folks that were in crisis. And through our relationships and our interactions in the community, public safety started to really see Whitebird Clinic as an alternative to having their officers, to having even fire and EMS services go out for a lot of these situations. And so in 1989, we formed what is now called the Cahoots program. Today, we're serving a metro area of over 250,000 folks. We respond to 24,000 calls for service annually. And just looking at what we do here in Eugene, I'm going to zero in. All the calls for service that Cahoots responds to are facilitated through our public safety dispatch. So whether you call 911 or the non-emergency line, every call, not just the ones for where somebody is explicitly saying, I'm in crisis, I need Cahoots, all those calls are being triaged for appropriateness for our response team. So out of the 105,000 calls that came into public safety in Eugene in 2019, Cahoots teams responded to 18,000 of those calls for service. And we only needed to call in police support 311 times out of those 18,000 calls. The situations that we respond to with our response teams, which are made up of an EMT and a crisis worker, are pretty broad ranging and aren't just about those very high acuity mental health crises, but we are able to do a lot of prevention work and engage in a lot of harm reduction through the integrated healthcare approach that we have. Cahoots response teams are handling the welfare checks, you know, those subject down calls, you know, the person shouting and in a neighborhood in the middle of the night, you know, the neighbor who's in distress. We also do a lot of work just helping folks get connected to resources. It can be really overwhelming in the middle of the night to try and figure out what number you're going to call in the morning. And so being able to call Cahoots to come out and talk to you about what your options are, what's going to be the most appropriate resource for you in that moment, can really help prevent a lot of that overwhelm from just kind of building and getting to the point of escalation. You know, additionally, there's just so much that we could talk about with the different types of responses, but ultimately, you know, this program, by being integrated into the larger public safety landscape, has really allowed us to achieve some very, very overt diversions from law enforcement, from further involvement with the criminal legal system, and even from unnecessary trips to the emergency room, or, you know, even those expensive ambulance rides that folks aren't able to pay for. We also are supporting a lot of other resources in our community by improving patient health outcomes, you know, reducing population health spending. So for us to focus just on what we do to impact law enforcement, I think is a little bit of a misnomer, because there is so much that really is directly impacted by the lack of appropriate behavioral health first response and systems throughout the country. And when we are talking about bringing something like the Cahoots program into a new community, we really need to look at all of those different points of intersection that this mobile crisis response is going to be impacting, and really start to look at you know, an entire ecosystem of, you know, as Tracy mentioned, the other resources that need to be put into place, you know, the other components of public safety that might need to be adjusted to really, you know, meet a community's needs.
Great, great. Thank you very much. And that's a great kickoff summary, and I'm sure we'll be back to talk some more about it. And Christy Lopez, can you talk a little bit about the work you've been doing in this space?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Marvin. Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone. As Tim says, thank you for taking time out of your day to be here. Um, I, I really look forward to hearing more from Dr. Kazee and Tim about their work. I'm going to give you my perspective, which is pretty much a systems perspective along the lines of Dr. Kazee's, really looking at how looking at some criteria you might want to be thinking about and paying attention to as you're thinking about the needs in your own community. And this is just sort of my take based on, I've been doing this work for about 25 years. One of my very first case with the Department of Justice was dealing with individuals, dealing with a system, the LA County Jail, where they at the time called themselves the largest mental health hospital in the country because they had thousands of individuals who were seriously mentally ill in the jail. And what I learned from that process, how really suboptimal that approach was. And then most recently, I've been addressing these issues in both in my role as the co-chair of the DC Police Commission and in my role heading up the Police for Tomorrow Fellowship, which is a project of the Innovative Policing Program at Georgetown Law, where I teach. And in those roles, we've been talking with individuals who are living with mental illness, providers, people who are trying to provide housing and care to people who are living with mental illness, and to police officers and who respond to these calls. And all of those individuals are, in my experience, equally crying out for a different system than what we have now. Police, as much as anyone else, do not want to be the people to respond to the vast majority of these calls. They know that they're not the right person, and for the vast majority of officers, they don't like that. So I've been thinking a lot about these issues in terms of how one might shift systems. And I think there's a few things to keep in mind, most of which have been touched upon already by Tim or Dr. Kazee. The first, I think, that we really need to be thinking about, and that often gets missed in this, is to make sure that we have, when we're thinking about alternatives to police for behavioral crises, we need to be thinking about having sufficient, and scope can be measured in a number of different dimensions. I think one of the most important ones is just to have someone there 24/7. That's one of the really critical things about Cahoots, and it's one of the things that's missing from almost every other one of these programs in the country. And that goes back to Dr. Kazee's point about just committing to it and resourcing it and scaling it up and making you are truly and genuinely, you see this as an alternative to police. Police are 24/7, and we're never going to have a true alternative unless we have a 24/7 alternative. So I think that's a really critical thing that it can't be emphasized enough. Yeah, the second thing I'll say is that in terms of scope is that you have to address mental health, but not only mental health crises. And that's what Tim was just referring to. There are all sorts of behavioral crises. There's drug addiction, reactions to drugs, homelessness, all of these sorts of things. You have to have a mechanism that addresses that, even if your focus is on behavioral crises, because those behavioral crises manifest themselves in so many different respects, and you can't address them unless you address these other features. I also think you need to think about crisis, but not only crisis. I think one of the really troubling things about the way we've approached this over the past decades is that we seem not to care about individuals living with mental illness until they intrude on our time, until they're crossing our path. And we really need to have a fundamentally different approach and realize the need to build up mental health outreach services, mental health day program services, mental health care for people in neighborhoods where there have been shootings or murders, the sort of the low-grade trauma and the serious mental illness. We need to care more about that and address that long before it becomes a crisis. It's a public safety issue, it's an ethical issue, it's just a quality of life issue that we've not been attendant to. And so we often talk about this in terms of crisis, but we really have to start much earlier than that. And then, of course, that will reduce the number of crises that occur. And those crises are much more harmful and they're much more costly. So it all works out well if we can just commit to doing that. And then finally, on the scope angle, I'll talk about whole government, but not only government. We clearly need to decenter policing and recenter public health and mental health, but we also need to do work building up communities and neighborhoods to understand these issues, to know their neighbors, like make it easier for people to help each other. That is something that we've not been attendant to, and there's a lot of work now being done with mutual aid. There has been for years, but it's now getting more prominence, and that should be a part of this as well. And I think we need to be educating our communities from the time of kindergarten. We should all be learning about mental health and about mental illnesses and about how this does impact our families and what we can do about it as a community. This should be part of our education, and that will help us build the communities and build the neighborhood structures that we need to address these issues. So in addition to scope, I think there are a few isms that we need to be very attendant to as we do this work. And again, both Tim and Dr. Kazee have addressed these. We need to attend to structural racism and race bias, even if we take police entirely out of the structure. I hope this doesn't come as a surprise to anyone, but the same biases that police have are also present in mental health workers, in social workers, in community workers. And those don't go away, and the harms that those cause don't go away. Many of the harms that those cause don't go away just because police are no longer on the scene. And we need to really we need to focus on that and really center that, and not assume that if we get police out of the picture, then we will no longer have a problem with people devaluing the lives of people of color and devaluing the lives of individuals who are living with mental illness. Similarly, we need to attend to the biases and against and the fear that people have against people who are involved in the criminal legal system. I remember, it seems quaint now, but I remember when I first went into the LA County jails, and I was working with not only the sheriff's department there, but also, well, I was investigating the sheriff's department there, and the Department of Mental Health of LA County was also involved. And I was really shocked at the time at how differently the Department of Mental Health, both sort of structurally and individually, treated their clients if they were in jail versus if they were on the street. They had a completely different attitude towards them. And it really influenced their policies, their approaches. And I've seen that sense in many, many places. I've also seen very different responses in other places, but it doesn't seem to be a thing that's gone away. Similarly, the psychiatrists and the psychologists that were assigned to work in the jails were afraid to meet with their patients. And again, this is something that we need to attend to. If we're going to shift from policing to non-policing responses, we need to make sure people are up for that task and can overcome what the fears and the biases they have, sufficient to do this work and to serve people well. And I think, finally, I think even with a full complement of alternatives, I personally think that we still need first responders who are especially trained to respond to individuals in crisis who are armed and behaving violently. I'm looking forward to hearing more from Cahoots about the limits of their response. Those 311 calls, when they did 311 times when they did call the police, I completely agree that we are way too quick to call police, and many things that look like crisis and on paper, you need a police response and it's violent. You don't actually need a police response. And many violent encounters can be resolved by people without any weapons whatsoever. But I do think there are times when you're going to need, whether you're going to need a police response, or even if you disagree with me on that, there will be a police response, because there will not be social service groups in the area who will respond. And for that reason, I think we need to really be thinking about either CIT models or co-responder models, where you have specially trained police officers, or whatever you want to call the first responder, who can respond in those instances and respond with enough, as much sort of training and education as you can provide, and experience with handling those sorts of calls to maximize the potential for a good outcome. And so I think that's something that we shouldn't forget, even as we decenter that response and go to alternatives. All of that really requires just shifting our culture, our training, in two ways. One, we just need to build up the logistics to do this. We need to have systems so that, you've got, as you do in Eugene, you've got a 911 system that directs people to the right place, that you have dispatchers who are on board with that you have police agencies and communities that are on board with that. And so that just logistically works. And then secondly, this really goes back to Dr. Kazee's comments. We need to commit to an approach that decenters police and puts recenters the response on health and community building. Because unless we do that, we're never going to scale it up. We're never going to get people on board. It'll always be the thing you cut as extra when there are budget cuts. And so that it's a real cultural shift we have to undertake, or none of these, as Dr. Kazee says, for years we've had these models. It's not that we don't know how to respond. We've just never committed to them in a way that allows us to sustain them and to scale them up so that they can reach their potential. And that's, I think, the biggest challenge that we all face, and we all have to overcome if this is going to become a reality. So thank you. I look forward to hearing more from my co-panelists.
Great. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Tim, do you want to respond a little bit to that question about um, the limits of your response and what happens?
Yeah, I think in order to really kind of talk about what happens on those responses, we need to recognize how many visual cues are sent that can potentially become a trigger when we have that uniformed officer respond to that, a situation where somebody's experiencing a crisis. Think about maybe you're at a barbecue at the park. You're not in crisis, right? You're just let's just imagine for a second that there's no pandemic. So we've all gathered, right? We're at the park, we're having a barbecue, and we hear the lights and sirens go by because there's something going on the other side of town. And there's a physiological response that we have, right? There's that stress response. Maybe you tighten up a little bit, you don't take as deep of a breath. You have that stress response just hearing those sirens go by. Now imagine that you are in that crisis, right? You're in that escalated moment, and these cars are coming screaming down the street. You're hearing them before you're seeing them, and they're putting you into an even more escalated place. And then you see that uniform that represents, maybe a family member's arrest that led to, homelessness because they couldn't maintain employment. You're seeing somebody who may remind you of, any number of the examples of police brutality that we've witnessed over the last year. The uniform itself can really be a trigger. That response can really be a trigger. And when Cahoots approaches these same types of crisis situations, one, we're not responding in an emergency fashion, so we're not rushing in. To borrow a term, your crisis is not my emergency. And so if I rush into this, then I am missing everything about you as an individual, and I'm focused on what I see and what my bias tells me is the priority. So with a more calm interaction, with training that's really oriented around unconditional positive regard and harm reduction, as opposed to a warrior mentality that says this is going to be a dangerous interaction if I don't use force, we can really create a place of empathy and mutual trust to engage in that interaction with. Our response teams don't wear something that looks like a traditional uniform. We wear a t-shirt that has a high contrast logo with Whitebird Clinic on the front, a lot of very minimal text, so that if there's a language barrier, we're not asking somebody to try and read something on our shirt before they understand who they're interacting with. We try to use just a lot more gentle touch too in those interactions. And through that mutual trust, through that objective of the least intervention necessary to support and stabilize somebody, we're not getting attached to outcomes. By recognizing how environmental factors can really influence how an intervention goes, we're able to do a lot, maybe to remove an audience by getting in the van and taking somebody to another location, or using that two-person team so that we have somebody who can really be focused on the patient in crisis while the other person is doing crowd control. And so through that recognition of how our appearance can be a trigger, how the way we interact with the individual in the space around us can also be a trigger, we are able to really maintain a lot safer spaces for these interactions to occur. In those 311 times I mentioned last year where we did need a call for police cover, those were either situations where we needed an involuntary hold because the individual was in such acute crisis that we couldn't get the contract for safety or the voluntary transport that we needed to get them to a higher level of care, or our verbal de-escalation isn't working and there's physical aggression, or we're needing to physically restrain somebody to keep them safe. So if we're getting to that point, chances are we've been going around in circles for a while, with that person. And when we do get to a place where we have to call in law enforcement support, our officers are trained to look for the Cahoots shirt, right? If there's a tussle, don't just run in and yank everybody apart. Look for the Cahoots staff. And so we get to provide that layer of insulation even when things are escalated. The officer is going to engage with the Cahoots response team, and then the three entities of the person in crisis, the Cahoots responders, and the officer are going to talk about what's going to happen next. The I guess most common term for that is the Cahoots or cuffs conversation, but ultimately really what this is saying like, hey, we are at a point where something needs to change. We either need to get you to another service, or we got to keep this from getting violent and aggressive again. So what can the three of us do to really, there's three parties do to really maintain that safer space? In the worst case scenario where we have somebody who's refusing Cahoot services, needs to get to the hospital, and the only way they're going to get there is in handcuffs in the back of the squad car, the Cahoots team doesn't disengage. We're still going to treat that as if we were the ones facilitating that transfer of care. We're going to follow the patrol car to the hospital so that there's two sets of civilian eyes watching what's happening during transit. And then when we get to the hospital and officers are bringing that person in handcuffs through the back door of the emergency room, we are also going to be following that officer and that patient in. We're going to be talking to the attending physician. We're going to be talking to the charge nurse. We're going to be talking to the mental health team, and really providing a lot of that context of things that we saw on scene before, law enforcement came out, before things started to escalate. So maybe we can give context and say there's no food in the fridge and the sink is full of dirty dishes. We observed that there are medication bottles just scattered all over the house. Providing a lot more of that context can really provide opportunity for us to advocate for, really the best utilization of those more emergent resources.
Thank you. Thank you. Then there's a question, I think, to all of you, but on the law enforcement side, and a lot of the responses have been, well, we need more CIT. Everybody needs CIT, or we need to make sure all officers get CIT, crisis intervention training. But it strikes me that we've seen that doesn't go deep enough and isn't a solution. Do you all have comments on that? Maybe you could start, Dr. Easton.
I do. So it doesn't go deep enough. And even in my 30 years in law enforcement, and I've been CIT trained, I think it is one of which having that awareness and understanding of what, crisis looks like. Because historically we weren't trained that way. We went in, the only option you had was to take someone to jail, and that was it. And so to really understand what crises look like for people, I think is very important. So don't take that as I don't think CIT is important. I think it is. And I think that having that education is helpful for some officers, but not all. And I think that what we have to really start to think about is we have to make some conscious decisions here. So it is either we need officers in very small few occasions, or we have to truly invest in a system where, eventually, and this is where the abolitionism and the defunding is coming from, where you don't see a gun and you don't see, as Tim just mentioned, the triggering of folks, because what you're talking about typically with Black and Brown folks is, multi-generational trauma here, even on the mental health side. And so really trying to go beyond what we know is, worked at the immediate, but to stretch that a little bit further. Again, I think CIT is important. Even in, NYPD, we increased the need for that because a lot of officers just did not get it, from recruitment all the way to those that were in service. I think it's equally as important, but it does not take the place of fully investing first in communities to make sure that they have what they need so they don't have to make a phone call. But then again, to look at, as Tim has mentioned and as Christy's mentioned, the alternatives come first. I still, even Tim, when you were giving your story, and saying we have to figure out a way, how do we take that person, to get them the help that they need because they're not coming voluntarily. Even the placing of the handcuffs is still traumatic. And I think that, we have to go beyond what this is the only way to get them there. And to me, the only way to do that is to get it from the beginning and be persistent and consistent about the funding and the responses and the care. And so most Black and Brown communities would tell you, even placing the handcuffs is not what we're looking for. We truly need something in the communities that gets to this before you call. And I want to also sort of lean to the culture of 911, which has been weaponized for officers. I mean, it's just unreal right now about what people call 911 about. I think we all know that. But we also know in this sort of reimagining space, as we look at the demand, and 911 calls are the one way to look at demand, 2 to 3% of those calls are true violent crime. The rest of those are social issues. So Christy was on point when she mentioned this is not just about mental health, it's about homelessness, joblessness, hunger, educate, all those things, all those social structures are failing people. And it's really, how do we get in on the front end and truly prop up and invest? And I think, Whitebird Clinic, certainly got it, right? The community's asking, have it be a community response. And I think we still have to sort of walk through and figure out really at what point do police come in? We certainly don't want people to harm themselves or others, but I'm not hearing, at what point do you have a family member who may be, even a better resource than a cop, to say, can you listen to me? We need to get you some help. So I just don't hear that extra sort of, if we're truly going to do a community response, then get the community in there to help with those responses as well. So I hear you on the CIT piece. Again, I'm not against that training. I think, training that works well and educates officers is important, but we have to stop letting that be the answer. You know, for me, it is like there are just places cops just don't need to be. They just don't need to be. And if we have someone that is, you know, harmed to themselves and they're, you know, harm to family members, then the system has failed once again because we didn't get those things shored up on the front end. So, you know, that's just me. And that's been my personal experience where I've gone to calls and clearly have looked at the situation and said, I'm not what you need, but yet I have no other resources to give you. And so I think I'm going to go back to, you have to look at how do you resource those responses and really wrap them around, you know, the individual and family as well. So.
Thank you. Other comments?
I would add, I really liked what Dr. Kazee said, you know, alternatives come first. And I really look forward to the day when we have a panel called, you know, police as an alternative to community responses to mental health, right? Because that's what we mean by decentering that. We talk a lot in our Police for Tomorrow group about, you know, we talk with the police officers a lot about them not allowing themselves to be used as tools for other people's, to, you know, execute other people's racism. And that's part of what's happening here. Even without all these systems, we have to, you know, police have to be able and willing to say, I'm not going, or I'm not doing this. This is not a place for me. And that can be very hard to do in some departments. And so that's part of the culture change. So there's no question the vast majority of the types of behavioral crises in communities, could be avoided if we had better mental health systems and better housing systems and medical systems. B, should get a response other than a police response. That said, I do think we need CIT, and I think we mean different things when we talk about that. So I want to just define what I mean by it. I think that every single officer should get 40 hours of crisis intervention training. Training involves individuals who are living with mental illness and their family members, them talking to them. That involves some, you know, training on like what to expect. There's some very good training out there. They should all get it. Right now, a lot of times departments will say we give them CIT. It's 8 hours. I don't think that's enough. You're gonna, you know, you get weeks and weeks of training on firearms, and most officers never even point their firearm, much less fire it. But you're likely to deal with a person in a mental health crisis maybe once a week, maybe more. So much more training is needed for every officer. At the same time, I do think that we should have specially trained groups of officers, at least as long as we have as many guns as we do in this country and have as few community services as we do in this country. We do need groups of specially trained officers, either in a co-responder model, which I personally prefer, where you have an officer and a social worker or a mental health worker, or 2 police officers, which many police departments seem to prefer, that are specially trained. And the reason why you want those special units, even though everyone in the department has training, you want those special who are just really good at this, who are just, you know, some people are just good at this. You select those people and then they get called to those calls. And so they get experience dealing with those calls. That's where you're going to get your better outcomes. Again, they only should go to those calls at that very small fraction of the kind of call that Tim was talking about, in the very, you know, few occasions when they can't be handled by somebody else, right? But they should be available for that so that we can maximize, you know, safety for everyone and empathy for everyone and caring. I think Tim said something, I'm not sure I got it down right, but an unconditional culture of caring or caring response. I love that. And police need to have that response too. And so I think we need to have that kind of training for them. And that's what I mean by CIT. And I think we need it even as we build up these community services.
Thank you very much. Let me go to some of the questions we have from James Doyle. Do you all have thoughts on a local practice of all stakeholders, non-blaming and event-focused learning reviews after a surprising outcome, I guess, or a bad outcome? Is that an effective way to look at what's happened?
So I think that's called Sentinel Event Review, and I think
Right.
James Doyle helped develop it. So I'm a big fan. There hasn't been as much evaluation of it as we'd like. I know Tucson does it. Tucson Police does it. Of critical incidents and other places do. But I think you need accountability and consequences in where there were violations. I think that's important. But I do think you can have that alongside a process for a non-defensive, non-blaming, interdisciplinary review of what went wrong. Again, looking at those systems perspectives, what can we fix so that this doesn't happen again?
Thanks. Other comments?
No, I would agree with Christy on that. I think that there are learning moments, but what the community would be asking for is accountability around those things, as well. So it's not just what did we learn and what do we do differently, but this is, that space where we're still having these conversations where if you put officers in those places, you're going to probably from your odds, you're going to get some kind of, different outcomes if you don't have the same people responding over and over again. But we've always said those reviews were one in which you could learn, but what the community is pressing on is that's fine if you want to learn, but if there were things that should have been done and they weren't followed, then people need to be held accountable to that. And so really, again, going back to that accountability piece, around as this particular space, as we figure out what does the future look like for mental health.
Thank you. So we're going to segue to a question from Elsa Haig about the ADA as applied to police, which has been a recent topic in Sheehan versus San Francisco and other places. And she says, in the short term, immediate term setting where alternative responses are not the norm, what can DOJ or other federal or state agencies to ensure that exigent circumstances are not such a gaping loophole to compliance with the ADA during arrests and investigations, especially when police create the exigency? You want to start with that, Christy?
It's a little bit eerie because I literally came to this panel from teaching my criminal procedure course where today we talked about exigent circumstances and police created exigency. So I think part of this is just a legal standard that we have to change, and that's a little bit difficult to do through democratic processes. It's a Supreme Court ruling, but there are ways that you can rein in that through state and local rules. And I actually think that this is something that has to be handled at the state and local level more than at the federal DOJ level, that you can make these as a matter of department policy, as a matter of state local ordinance, as well as a matter of state law. That's where I would be focusing on addressing this rather than at the federal level.
Tracy, did you have a comment?
No, I was shaking my head in agreement. It is
Okay.
about, it's about state and local, and it is about the policies and making sure people are, adhering to those things, because you can reduce that, whole conversation around exigent circumstance, and we see this with de-escalation, right? The demand on de-escalation in certain spaces as well. So, absolutely, I'm just in agreement.
Okay, thank you. Here, a question from Jeff Swanson. Do you see law enforcement as mainly a source of resistance or advocacy for reducing, reimagining the role of policing in responding to behavioral health crises? Any of you want to take that?
I mean, my work has put me in touch with law enforcement agencies across North America, and time again, we hear from patrol officers that they are exhausted spending their entire shift enforcing camping bans, talking to folks who are in crisis because of issues related to poverty, homelessness, addiction, or mental health. This is not what most officers signed up for. And, command staff are tired of seeing resources go to really heavy-handed response because there just isn't anything else in the community. The only times that we've really encountered any sort of resistance from other municipalities exploring services based on the Cahoots model has really been from the union wanting to make sure that their officers are being protected and that contracts aren't going to be violated. And even that we generally are able to really address by really recognizing how this work can really kind of support more efficient resource allocation for those other more traditional systems. It's not just the communities out there saying that we want somebody other than officers responding. It's the officers saying we need somebody else to be doing these calls.
Well, it also occurred to me as Christy was speaking before about resources that we sort of have gotten into this position because law enforcement is seen as a free good. And that, hence it's relied on for all those 911 calls, but it isn't a free good. And we need to figure out how to deal with that.
Yeah, and it's that, that reliance on the 911 system, that impulse to just call the police because something looks wrong, that really motivated the Cahoots response to be dispatched through that public safety system. I think we need to really recognize that calling a mobile crisis service that's dispatched by public safety obligates somebody to have enough privilege to find comfort and feel safety in calling that general public safety line to access us. But by recognizing the impulse of so many communities to just call the police when when there's a crisis, I would argue that's why we've been able to make the level of impact that we have, and why we're handling 24,000 calls for service a year in a community of less than 250,000.
Okay, thank you. So from Isabel Shapiro, if a community is interested in transitioning from a pure CIT model to a civilian co-response crisis response model, where should that community start? What are the first steps? Where does funding fit in? Maybe your experience is most relevant, Tim, in terms of how you start to get traction with your clinic.
I mean, the traction really starts by listening. And making sure that when we are having these conversations about this system, that they're, the table's big enough for everybody to have a seat. And that doesn't mean that we all need to be in agreement. Really, if anything, we need to prioritize dialogue with those most polarly opposite to us, and so it's really starts by listening to the community. From there we can identify the other resources that are needed. Cahoots doesn't operate in a vacuum. We have the level of success that we have the high amount of cost savings a year because we can help get folks to connected to all these other resources, because we are part of a larger coalition of services in our community. And so there's two things. There's really making sure that we're listening to everybody, and that the lived experience, that consumer voices have just as much of a say as police chiefs or a fire captain does. The second thing is really to look at how traditional policing is costing a community money in less direct ways. The Cahoots program, by responding the way that we do with the broad scope of services that we have, saves our hospital system over $14 million a year. We save Medicaid in our community $4 million a year. We can, by taking the time to really look at how the lack of a mobile crisis system is costing a community money in other ways, you can really start to identify, where the potential cost savings are going to be felt and where you might be able to divert some dollars. I think I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that on a federal level, Senator Ron Wyden is reintroducing the Cahoots Act this week in Congress. And if this passes, this would provide Medicaid block grants to fund 95% of the program operations. We're seeing similar legislation at the state level here in Oregon, where, by declaring a mental health state of emergency, we're going to be able to really allocate a lot of needed funds to prop up sobering centers and start to implement mobile crisis programs in every major community in our state. So this isn't just about city dollars. This could be looked at more regionally. I'm optimistic about what's happening at the federal level, but it takes a multi-pronged approach, right? Just like we need to have a lot of different services involved to really make these responses effective. We need a lot of those key stakeholders to be engaged at every level of program design and to be advocating for as diversified as funding as possible.
Thank you. Do others of you have comments on the funding landscape for such programs, since they would be incremental funding somewhere?
I'll just say I think the funding is obviously key, and police officers do say that we do too much, and then you say, okay, well, why don't we give some of your money to somebody else so they can do it? And then suddenly the conversation takes kind of stalls. And so we need to get we either need to get police departments on board, or we need to just, say, sorry that you don't like this, but we're going to shift these funds and we're going to fund these other areas, because that money has to come from somewhere. And unfortunately, especially right now, that's going to be a challenge. I think that requires a couple of things. I think we do want to try as much as we can in these block grants. I didn't know about that. That's amazing. That could be a way to do this. I think we're going to have to build up those alternatives before it'll be easier to reduce policing if we build up those alternatives first, because people are frightened. And if they see something that works, then they'll be much like, oh, well, I don't need this because we have this other thing that's better. I think it's going to be very challenging in the current and coming climate, that state and local jurisdictions are going to face. So I think it's going to be helpful if we can get police officers and police to understand the importance of this and that this really is in their best interest and it's not a threat to their identity or their existence. And I think if we can work with them and have those conversations, that will be helpful. I also think it really should make us think deeply about the true costs of the way we're policing now. And the fact is that policing for many of us is pretty much a free good. But for other communities and other individuals, it is very, very costly in very different ways. And we really have to be more attentive to those costs and care more about those costs so that we can see that we're not saving as much money as we think, and that we're having all sorts of human costs that we just really, we can't go on, we can't ignore any longer.
Thank you. So this from Merritt Hofer, any calls to redirect mental health response away from law enforcement into community-based services requires a certain amount of re-education of the public, which has become used to calling the police for any reasons. In what ways do you think it's possible to alter the default response of the public in terms of who is called to respond to these types of social welfare issues? Who wants to take this?
Yeah, I can start by talking about some of the outreach and public education that we do, because in addition to the dispatch responses that Cahoots team engage in 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we really understand that the community needs to know what to expect when they see those vans show up, when to call us in, and how to do so in ways that really empower us to do our best work in de-escalation and prevention. And so there are a few different points. One is that recognizing the importance of education in mental health. Every 8th and 10th grader in the 3 school districts in our community receive a presentation from Cahoots first responders on mental wellness, common presentations, understanding what your friend or a peer might be going through, and then how to approach them to say, I'm worried about you and I'd like to help, I'd like to help get you connected to somebody who can maybe help you out. Many services and volunteer groups throughout our community also receive de-escalation training from Cahoots personnel. This is the same training that we offer to our staff. And that really helps, our community at large have access to the same skills that we're going to applying. And so maybe somebody could effectively de-escalate their roommate and then call Cahoots in to talk about things when they're in a much more calm space, and that roommate has somebody who's familiar, right? Who has that comfort and understands what their day in and day out is like. Over this past year, as there have been more opportunities for our community to exercise their First Amendment rights, we've also seen a lot more needs for Cahoots and White Bird Clinic to be engaging in more widespread public education. And so at many events over the summer, both virtual and in public outdoors and with social distance measures in place, we've also engaged in a direct training that we call When to Call the Cops. And this isn't, intended to be a criticism of one, public safety system over another, but really just a recognition of our obligation as community members and neighbors to understand the impact of placing that call to 911 or to the non-emergency line, and to really take a moment to pause, consider what's going to happen after we make that call, and maybe think about how we could interact with that person who we perceive to be in crisis or perceive to be in need of some sort of services. It's also an opportunity in that training to, offer an inflection point. Why is it that I feel this impulse to call 911? Because I see somebody who is shouting at the sky. Are they doing anything illegal? What's really going to be accomplished by removing that element from my community? Is it that I'm going to feel better, or is it that they are receiving services, and recognizing when it's more about us and our experience in the world as opposed to whether or not somebody actually needs some help or some support, we can really start to challenge why it is that folks are making those calls in the first place.
Thank you. Other comments?
No, I think Tim is 100% on really a lot of that, and that is how you start the education around mental health. And we know culturally there's quite a bit of stigma around mental health, and what does it look like when you ask for help or need help? Especially with Black men and Black women to a certain extent, and Black and brown, I would say. And so there really is a need not just to educate the children, but to really expand that. And I think Tim's group does do that with adults. Sit down and have a conversation about why watching your mental health and understanding what you need as an individual is important. But I also have to go back to this culture of 911 and 100%. We have our this conversation with our kids all the time about when do you call the police and when do you don't, but really moving away from 911 and introducing things like 211 or 311, that you give them that departure. So you don't even have to call it. You just need to, here's a completely different number for you to focus on. Because, you know, we were all raised with those 3 digits. From the moment we were in elementary school, we were told if you are in trouble, dial those 3, right? So it is deeply ingrained in our culture about safety. And it is also too, and we sort of touched on this in our earlier comments, but it's also based on what you deem to be scary and what you're afraid of and fearful of. And there has been, you know, we know this from the science, that you connect, you know, people of color with, you know, if they are acting a certain way, with them being potentially violent. And so really beginning to ask those questions about why you're dialing that number. And I think Tim hit it. You really need to sit with yourself and say, okay, are you dialing this because you're scared or because you're perceiving something that may not be happening? And then providing yet a complete alternative number for someone to call if you have them on that particular piece. Because we've seen this move from 911 to platforms like Nextdoor, where we have police involved. You know, they have connections to police officers who, you know, post information, or this is a quick way for you to alert people. So, I mean, it's not just 911. We have to look at all the other social media pieces that now come into play on how we communicate and reinforce what we believe about what's going on in those spaces back and forth. So I like what Tim said about you have to get to the kids, but I also get worried about kids having that recognition and trying to explain that to an adult. Those usually don't go well. And so, you know, just making sure you broaden on that.
So the emergence of a 988 line, a national crisis hotline, Ashley Kreider points out, is on the horizon. Is that going to redirect these kind of calls?
I think 988 has the potential to redirect some of those lower acuity situations where it's really just about finding a way to connect to somebody. You know, just having that touch point of a person outside of your experience. Here, local to Oregon, we're wondering if 988 could become a better point of dispatch, you know, for the Cahoots response, rather than asking folks to go through the public safety system. What if we just focus on building up a behavioral health emergency response system instead?
Right. Okay, I want to thank you. I think we should stop here. I want to thank each of you for your terrific contributions. This has been a great conversation from your different perspectives. And so we're going to thank you, and hopefully we'll be able to have another conversation like this in the near future. But thanks to everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Christy. See you soon.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.